I have about hundreds of questions. I'll only ask 2 questions of this. This will open questions to the floor. You do quote Roscoe Papa in the book, live in truth by forming alternative spaces. Can you talk about how you envision some of these spaces that people don't?
This is Howell's 1978 essay, Powerless, which I think is a really important essay. Because this gets to the core of my battle with laptop. We can't beat security and surveillance state at their own game. There's a kind of incongruity to it. But our greatest strength is our powerlessness, our transparency. Because we articulate a fundamental truth about power and about where we're going, that those who are in power do not know it's expressed. And that's why they're trying to shut us down. That's why they marginalize us, demonize us, and push us out of the mainstream. Canada actually has a little more space than the United States. And I can get on the CBC, where I'll be on tomorrow with the current shows. I can't get on national media in the United States. Almost never. The acceptable range of opinion now. It's what Dorothy Parker used to say about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress. It goes from A to B. That's sort of where we are. And it's, these kinds of critiques are more palatable outside the United States, certainly within Europe. I was just in France and Belgium. A couple of my books are out in French. And even here. But in the States, it is to become a pariah. I think that, we live, and John Rawls Saul's done a pretty good job of laying this out. We live in one of these twilight periods in history where the language we use to describe our reality doesn't correspond to what's happening. I mean, how can you talk about laissez-faire capitalism when you have a firm like Goldman Sachs that is bailed out for every penny on the dollar, and then the federal government gives it virtually zero interest loans to gamble, to speculate? They run the largest commodities index in the world. It's insane, and yet the very ideology that these sort of corporate oligarchs espouse doesn't in any way match the reality that sustains them. In the 17th century, speculators were hung. Now they run the global economy and the political systems. But speculation is considered a crime. And one of the reasons that I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs is because I've been in Africa and I covered the famine in Sudan. I've seen hundreds of kids starve to death because they can't afford wheat, corn, and all those staples by which you survive because these people are hoarding it in the futures market. And wheat alone is in prices around 100% in the last year. And it's to feed this kind of mania for profit. And people literally die because of it. I think Havel nailed it. He was a great dissident, and he was a mediocre president. He's a perfect example of why you don't want to go into power the same way with Mandela, and that he, in order to take power in South Africa, had to walk away from the ANC's economic plan, which was socialist, and call for the nationalization of resources and everything else. Havel ends up supporting the Iraq War, but as dissidents, they were both amazing figures. And I think that when you face a center of power that is this decayed and this corrupt, speaking that truth terrifies them, because they know internally, even more than you do, how game the system is. And I went to school with a lot of these people, so I know them. One of the people I went to school with is a manager for BlackRock, which is one of the largest investment companies in the world. They took over the $30 billion in toxic assets left over by the Lehman Brothers collapse, and he spent 2 years hiding what those assets were. Remember, this is all junk, and reselling it out on the market as assets. That was his job. So they know internally, and that, what breaks these corrupt regimes is when the foot soldiers of the elite will not use force to protect them. So that when the demonstrations in Leipzig got to be about 70,000 people, Erich Honecker, the communist dictator, sends down a parachute division in Leipzig to shoot the crowd. And they won't do it. Honecker doesn't last more than another week in power. Same thing in the Russian Revolution. They send the Cossacks in to quell the Petrograd Red Riots. And the Cossacks not only don't fire in the crowd, but start fraternizing with the crowd. At that point, the Tsars abdicate. That's how revolutions work, and I think that the centers of power are that fragile. That if we can build the kinds of mass movements, and you see in Montreal they've done a pretty good job of this, if we can build these kinds of movements, and the technique is to draw sections of the power elite towards you, like the police, and that creates paralysis inside the centers of power. And they lose the ability to defend themselves. And I think that is, the technique we certainly have to try and build.
There's been quite a few articles written lately about the relationship between psychopaths and CEOs. Okay, one more question. So you come by your activism naturally. Your father was a Presbyterian minister who was on the vanguard of standing up for civil rights and gay rights. You believe that resistance is the most important ingredient of spirituality, but you mentioned the proliferation of something that you describe as false spirituality. Can you comment?
Yeah, it's this sort of, how is it with me spirituality, which is not spirituality, it's called narcissism. For me, and King gets it, Barron gets it, true spirituality arises through acts of resistance. And King has a beautiful passage in, I think it's Strength to Love, towards the end, after his house is firebombed, and he's sitting alone in the kitchen in despair, in which you find that strength, that spiritual force to keep going. And I think that the secret is really to never sever yourselves from the oppressed. You don't want the oppressed to become an abstraction. It's why, I just spent 2 years with the poorest people in the United States, but it's also why I teach in a prison, because when you build relationships with people who are incarcerated, especially those who never had a chance, there'll always be like 4 or 5 inmates in there who are just so hungry to learn, and it just rips your heart out. They're so smart, they're so talented, and every door was shut. That's what it means to be poor. You never get a second chance. If you're rich, like George Bush, you get chance after chance. You can be a cokehead and a drunk and go AWOL, and you never have a job till you're 40. But if you're poor, you don't get a second chance. And so you can't walk out of that prison, and have those relationships and not be angry and not fight back, because you have an ability to fight in a way that they don't. Augustine said that hope has 2 beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and the courage to see that they don't remain the way they are. This was a really emotionally devastating book to write for both of us, because the stories of despair and struggle are just heartbreaking and unnecessary. And I think that, for me, that's where spirituality comes from. It comes from, my dad was pretty much thrown out of the church. He was thrown out of the church. Or he wasn't thrown out of the church, but he couldn't get a church. He was involved in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, but what killed him was the gay rights movement, because his brother, his youngest brother, my uncle, was gay and lived with his partner in Greenwich Village, and my father had a particular sensitivity of the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 1960s, but he also had the ability not to particularize it, to understand that there were, tens of thousands of people like his brother were suffering. So, and in the church in the 1970s, just because he was Presbyterian, were very, very unforgiving for that stance. Well, I went to Colgate University. He had a church in Syracuse, which was about an hour away. And when my father found there was no gay and lesbian organization, he brought the gay speakers to my campus. And so, and I have to confess that I was certainly one of the most committed heterosexuals at Colgate. But I would sit around with my dad and groups of gay activists and other students, talking about dignity and other ways of being. And eventually, my father started telling the students that they had to form a gay and lesbian alliance. And they said, we're just too uncomfortable coming out of the closet. And so one day my dad drives down, he takes me to lunch, and he says, okay, you're gonna have to start it. So I founded the Gay and Lesbian Alliance. I never went, but I would go into the dining hall and I would take my card and check it off of the meal and hand it back to me and go, faggot. One of the last times I heard mine was quite poignant. The church started coming down on my dad for this stance. And it was a great example for me because I, at a very young age, realized that you're not rewarded for virtue. And I realized that all institutions, as Paul Tillich says, including the church, are inherently demonic. And so the church wanted him silenced, and his response was to organize an Easter service for GBTL people in the city of Syracuse publicly. And he came down and got me because he said, this is probably one of the last times you'll ever hear me preach. He was a great preacher, and he was right. And he got up, and, he defines my life. He got up in that service and he said, marriage is a sacrament. It is not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that refuses to honor the sacrament of marriage does not deserve to call itself Christian.